Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you have enjoyed your lunch. My name is Kathrin Komp. I am from the research department of the Finnish Center for Pensions, and I'm delighted to moderate this second session where we get deeper into the life course effects of on pension and retirement. We will have 2 presentations and 2 comments, and hopefully also a bit time for discussion afterwards. First, we will have Kathrin Komp from the University of Helsinki. Kathrin is assistant professor of social gerontology, and her research focuses on how population aging challenges welfare states and societies from the life course perspective. Welcome, Kathrin.
Okay, can anybody hear me? No. Now you can? Yes. Nice. Okay. Hi everybody. I'm glad to see that so many of you are still here after lunch. And I'm standing in front of my picture, which I was not supposed to do as I was told. Okay, I could also open my presentation. Okay. I'm learning technical things apparently at the moment. Yeah. This morning we already heard a lot about labor markets, pensions and life courses, and I think that the presentations this morning did a really good job at outlining the situation and also highlighting some problems. So what I would like to do is basically not give you more facts about the topic, because I think we already covered that pretty well. What I would like to do is just give you a different perspective on these facts. So just shift the facts around a bit, so I can highlight 2 points that I would like to make. So in that sense, it's probably a continuation of the discussion we had this morning, but to some degree maybe also already like a comment on that, which I think it's nice because then it also like ensures some continuation within the day. And what I'm going to talk about is, well, how we can look at these phenomena from the life course perspective. And I thought I'll start with the main message because it's right after lunch and maybe you're already ready for the weekend or still with your thoughts at the nice lunch. The main message is that, well, when we look at our lives and at how our lives progress, there are dynamics within our lives. So developments over time. And we have to think about those developments and causal effects over time when we think about pensions and discuss them. And one important point is that if we introduce pension reforms and they try to make a rather quick change, they're still kind of trying to counteract their work with those developments over time. And if you see their developments over time, then a short change might not be sufficient for really reaching the kind of effect the pension reforms want to have. So really like pension reforms that only work within a short frame because of that cannot succeed. This is the first message. I'm going to tell you more about that in a moment. And the other one is if you look, or if you use the life course perspective to look at recent historical events, then you will also see that the economic crisis will have effects in the years and even decades to come because of those time-delayed effects. And the crisis will have effects on retirement and on pensions also in the further future. So there will be effects that we will see in a few decades. So we will still have to deal with this phenomenon for quite a while. And basically what I'm going to do is use exactly the information we had until now and just introduce this life course perspective to show you how we can arrive at those conclusions now. Okay? Main part is the life course. We already spoke about that. Life course means it's just everything that happens in your life. And, well, if you think about your own life, you will know there's a lot going on. It's not just work, it's also caregiving, family, it can be about moving house, migrations. However, usually when we talk about the life course and try to describe it, with the pointy thing, we stick to a model that's centered around work. So it's youth as the time before work, middle age as the time of work, and old age, that starts with retirement, as the time after work. We already heard criticism on this model, like Anna Dadio pointed that out, that life courses are not that simple, especially the ones of women are more diverse. So if you really want to show the situation in a population, you would actually have to use several models to describe that. I once did a calculation for people who are aged 65 years and older in 2009, and it turns out for them actually 2 out of 3 of these people have a life course that follows that model. So it's not as bad as you might think. Where it's bad, like that 1/3 that's not covered, is usually women. And what you have to take into account there is homemaking, how that fits into their life course. So that's also a bit in line with what Dirk said. If you talk about men, it's easy to describe it and model it, and labor market effects have a strong effect. When you talk about women, situation is a bit different, and you would have to take a more, well, diversified approach and look at inequalities. But anyways, for what I'm going to talk about, this model is sufficient because it just shows that there are things that happen in youth and they can continue then through the working life and into old age and so on to retirement. So the idea is there are effects that go over time and shape this whole life course. And those life course influences or life course effects I'm talking about, it's a term that's used sometimes a bit vaguely. I'm going to use it in 2 senses. One is the one about effects within life courses. So if you think about that model, youth, so socialization, education, then working, and then retirement, the idea is that there are dynamics that develop within this model, so events that can trigger follow-up events. And that way, you have really like sequences of events that happen that can then influence retirement. So there we are, for example, talking about the scarring effects of unemployment. So that's also what we heard, like if there's unemployment, it has effects on the pensions you receive later on. It can also trigger more unemployment spells later on or lead to non-employment. And the other sense in which this can also be used that I'm also going to talk about is here influences on the life course. So one was influences within the life course, so dynamics within it. The other is influences on the life course. And that happens because institutions such as pension regulations but also laws can shape what the life course looks like. So most obvious example is, of course, pension reforms and like the statutory retirement age. But if you look at youth, it can also be things like the age when, like laws that regulate when people are allowed to work and how long people have to stay in school. So institutions can also have an influence on the life course, and through that on labor market careers and then also on retirement. And I want to look at or adopt those 2 perspectives and see what that tells us now about retirement. Okay, the first thing was dynamics within the life course. I showed it here. Here I've the life course. So what happens is, for example, an event here that has a follow-up effect and so on, and that can then influence when you retire. The most obvious example is what we already spoke about several times today, is the accumulation of the rights to pensions. Because it depends on your labor market career, so also on like unemployment spells or non-employment spells in between. So I think this is like really straightforward. But we also have the example of unemployment spells that then can then influence your health and your well-being, the further career progression, how much pension benefits you get, the chances of being unemployed again. It can also lead to non-employment and then influence the timing of retirement. So there are several like dynamics that really, like if something happens to you within the labor market or in another area, can then carry on over years or decades and then influence when you retire. And this is really critical when we look now at the economic crisis. Here I have the 2008 economic crisis as an example, but we also heard about the 1990s recession in Finland. It's the same mechanism, basically. Because the economic crisis can be one such event that influences the life course. We already heard it increases unemployment rates. And usually the unemployment rates, we also heard it, I don't know who said that before, unemployment rates among youth are particularly high. we heard that, and we also know it, like, especially when we now look at the 2008 crisis, like Southern Europe, like Spain, for example, really extremely high, or also Ireland when we look at it. And the idea here is that actually when youth experience unemployment, it's not just this one thing that happens to them and then it goes away, but it can influence the rest of their life courses. So it kind of directs their life courses in a new direction. And there are even some people who speak about a new lost generation forming. The idea of the lost generation, originally was used for the generation that fought in World War I. It was used by Gertrude Stein and then picked up by Hemingway. And the idea there is that if some kind of thing happens to them that puts them into a disadvantaged situation in youth, it can bring further disadvantages throughout the life course, and they might never get out of that again, or they might never recover. So here's already the sense that if we have a recession that hits youths, we might get problems later on that can then also like influence retirement. So the age when they retire and how many pension benefits they're gonna receive. What also some researchers say, like Dale Denifer, is there's something called cumulative disadvantages or cumulative advantages, and the idea here is with those events that happen one after the other, it's not just random, but if you're in a good situation, more good things will come. But if you have a problem, the problems will accumulate. So unemployment can then lead to financial problems, health problems, well-being. So it's like some kind of downward spiral. And that's also why unemployment spells for younger people are particularly problematic, because there the effects have a longer time to develop. So you can imagine, like, if those people get into those downward spirals, like you've got 30 years for those downward spirals to develop, many things can go wrong. And so if we think about it this way, then we can already say, like, already now what we can foresee is that in about 30 years, or if we now say, like, Finland with the 1990s recession, probably a bit earlier, there will be a bunch of people who retire then that will have had many unemployment spells, or also like non-employment spells then through their life course. Because of that, their pension benefits will not be that high, so old age poverty will become a bigger problem. And those people will probably also retire later, just because they did not work enough to qualify for early retirement. So we can already, like, just with this logic see that, like, at the horizon there's a problem coming up in about 30 years for most European countries, Finland a bit earlier. And we should be aware of that. Then, if you apply the same logic now and look at older people, so I made a happy older person now, you saw a younger person before, then the story is a little bit different, even though the problematic is similar. Older people are less affected, or were less affected by the crisis in terms of unemployment rates, and but the problem here is when an older person becomes unemployed, I think Dirk also mentioned that, the chances of finding a new job again are rather low. So this means, okay, maybe they are not that heavily affected, but once they're affected, they're basically out of the labor market. And then they remain unemployed or non-employed. So for them, you remember those downward spirals? They then have less time to develop until retirement, but there's also not much you can do about that anymore. So once they got unemployed, it's pretty much game over. So this is quite a different situation than for younger people. But like what's really a problem now here is that all this happens in times of population aging. We already heard that at the end from one of the discussants who also mentioned that like population aging is going on. We need to think about it. It would be great if people would work longer. But if we are now in a situation where like people are pushed out of the labor market and it's hard to get older people into it, like this is kind of not helpful. So this puts basically governments into a situation where they need to decide like what they're supposed to do with this situation. Because they could continue with the logic and say, okay, we have this problem with population aging and we don't have enough people who contribute to pension schemes and too many people who receive pension schemes. So let's try to facilitate the labor market integration of older people. Meaning if there's structural unemployment, we don't have enough jobs, older people should have the priority because of population aging. Which would fix the short-term problem with population aging, but it would like create a huge problem then with younger people here, because we know if we don't give them jobs now, we will get into those downward spirals, we will get those lost generations, and then the problems will come back to us just a few decades later. So it's actually not about like solving the problems, it's just more about on which generation do I want to dump those problems? And do I want to deal with those problems now, or do I want to deal with them in a couple of decades? Of course, you could argue, yeah, if we say we prioritize older people in our efforts to keep them in the labor market, and because for younger people, okay, they might have more severe consequences, but we still have a few decades to fix them. This means that if we would really use the strategy, we would actually need to really start to invest also in active labor market policies for younger people. So just targeting one age group or one generation is not going to work. Yeah. And so you end up with this like kind of dilemma that I try to draw here. When you look at those dynamics that happen, here it's like the economic crisis creates the dynamics. For younger people, for older people, it's the dynamics, so the crisis. Yeah, the reaction to the crisis depends on their life courses, because like how older people can react to unemployment spells also depends on how their previous labor market careers progressed. If they had like stable labor market careers and were working full-time, they can retire earlier. But if there were those like patchwork careers with long spells of unemployment, then they cannot retire earlier, and they basically have to sit there and wait until they finally reach the statutory pension age. So there you also see like how those life course effects play out with economic crisis is totally different whether you talk about older or younger people. Then the time span of the effects is different. For younger people, we saw like it can take decades for all those effects to really play out until they reach retirement age. For older people, the effects are really immediate because they're about to retire. But the effects then are also different. Here they can be more severe because for younger people, because they can play out and develop over several decades. Whereas for older people, it's less severe because they have less time to develop. But for intervention, there's not much you can do anymore once older people become unemployed, compared to younger people where you still have time and possibilities to intervene. So it's kind of like I wouldn't say lose-lose game. It's more a philosophical game of like, how do you want to prioritize people now when you talk about effects of the crisis and active labor market policies? Because you cannot fix everything, and you cannot like, fix the situation for everybody. So you really need to decide what is the most urgent problem now. Is it pension policies fixing it right now? Is it the economic crisis? Is it younger or older people? And when exactly can pension schemes take the additional shock of having this group of people who, well, did not contribute that much? And also, it's also, I think, a game of fairness between generations, because you basically, what you're doing here is you're trying to decide on which generation which generation can handle it if they have longer periods of unemployment or non-employment in between. So there you also have to think about like how many disadvantages did each generation already have, and how will that play out into old age then when you make this decision. So this is like highly value driven and ethically loaded, I would say. And a side effect is then also that with those dynamics within life courses, there's the idea that we have linked lives, which means whatever you do and how you live your life, you do not act in a vacuum. Your life is connected to the lives of the people around you, and so if something happens to you, it will also affect them. And if something happens to them, it will also affect you. That's what those linked lives say. And the prime example is always like within families, and then the gender dimension, like within couples. What happens, because one thing you have as a reaction to the crisis is, for example, also migration that can increase. So that ties in really nicely with Traute's presentation. And usually when you're in a couple and one partner migrates, well, you can decide how you want to handle that. Either you also migrate with that person, or you decide to stay in a different country. And I know of people in this room who are in a situation like that, so I'm not going to comment on that more. You might know what I mean. But this can tear relationships apart if you don't migrate. But like if you migrate, it's like your life is influenced by the labor market career of your partner. And another reaction within families to the economic crisis was also delayed family formation. This sometimes happens, not for everybody. So again, a question of social inequalities, and I get Joachim Palmer is going to come back to that in his presentation. Possibly. Maybe. We'll see. And delayed family formation, some people decide to have children later because of the economic crisis, because they want to be economically secure first. So there you can also see that a secondary effect, again, is like through like families and linked lives, so they can have like really big effects that then spread out. And what can happen as a total because of that is that population aging, or the speed of population aging, can increase. Because as Traute said, like if there's a country that's in a crisis, you don't want to go there to work, maybe like you will want to get away from there. But like if we know that especially youths suffer from unemployment, and if they are the ones who leave the country, then this means as a consequence of an economic crisis, that country might actually lose younger people, which would then speed up the process of population aging in those countries as a side effect. So the country would have both problems then, or start with one problem, economic crisis, and then the follow-up problem is that population aging suddenly also speeds up. So that would not be helpful. We could, of course, then talk about how do we get those people to come back then to that country, but that's probably not what Traute is better at. Yes, but so, as you already saw, like this life course effect, or this idea of life course dynamics, can tell you a lot about what will happen to pension schemes and the lives of people. And the second thing I wanted to talk about is about how institutions shape life courses. You remember that I said there are institutions like pension regulations. So, for example, at what age can we retire? When do we have to retire? How many pension benefits can we get? But there are also other things like for younger people, as I said, at what age can you start to work? What are the regulations if you have a child? Like how long do you take off? Do you still accrue pension benefits during that time or not? And all those things are called like institutions or regulations, and they shape the life course, and they can also directly affect when you retire. And with this thing, there is a discussion. It's actually already an older discussion. You see here, I've got a book from '94 that talks there's a structural lag going on. And what they say is that it takes a while for social structures to react to changes in the lives of people. So there you have the lives of people and social structures. And the idea here is that the lives of people influence social structures. And those authors argued that it takes a while. So this, for example, now when we see life courses change, we've got more migration, fragmented work biographies, more unemployment rates. It will take a while for pension schemes to respond to that. So we will be in some kind of lag situation or a gap where life courses and institutions do not totally fit. But when you look at it from the life course perspective, down here, then you will see that actually also the opposite situation is true. Because if you change social structures, as I showed in that picture, that can influence life courses. But this influence will not always directly take effect. It can also just create like a situation where structures and life courses do not really fit together. And that's what I referred to earlier on when I said, like, if you introduce a pension reform, lives will not always directly change in the way how this reform introduces it. So instead of, like, for example, if we would raise the pension age from 65 to 67, people would not necessarily start to retire at age 67 directly. There could also be quite a phase of confusion in between and mixed results. And Heikki Tikanmäki, for example, wrote a really nice paper about that, where he and other people looked at the effects of the pension reform, and they also saw, like, you do not get everybody to really retire at the age where they're supposed to retire. There is some kind of like mixed results. It goes in the right direction, but it's not perfect. And you can explain that result with those theories here. Because if you remember what I said before, that there are like long-term developments at play, and then influences also come from different points in your life, like for example from how long you went to school, whether you participated in lifelong learning, whether or not you had children and at what age, how long you had a break in your career because of children. It could also be from the savings you made, and also what's really, really important and a big issue is also from your own preferences and your ideas about what you want to do. Because those are really hard to change, and many really come like from youth. And then if you just change the structures and the institutions and the rest does not change, you see there has to be some kind of tension in between. Because you cannot, somebody who stopped going to further qualification offers at some point because they decide to retire soon, then say you have to work longer, but if this person does not have the necessary like education and skills anymore, there's not much you can do. Or if somebody already set up like a private pension scheme and started to save money so they could retire at a certain age, and then you say you have to work longer, but that person already has the private pension scheme in place, like you also will not have any effect. So, yeah, those like short-term actions might not be as effective as one would like to. But just on a side note, really quickly, because I'm running out of time, what pension reforms can definitely do, also on the short term, is create some turmoil in what the perception of old age is and how old age is understood. That's just because the idea of what old age is tied to the retirement age. It used to be the idea that old age starts when people retire, and it used to be the idea that this would be the age when people start to have health problems, so these ideas are really linked. Nowadays, they're drifting further and further apart, but if you introduce a pension reform, you basically interfere in the definition of old age. So you can really quickly with a pension reform create some kind of like confusion about what old age is and get those dialogues and discussions going, also in newspapers and among people. But the effect on the lives of people, that might be a bit more difficult. And I brought you one of my favorite pictures to show what I meant. So it's basically the same thing I said before, now just in a picture. What you have, it's like in a variation of a Lexis diagram. What you have here is time, so those would be the years, and here is age. And those lines here that are diagonals, they are basically cohorts. So this means each of them is a group of people. And so, for example, we could say like this is the cohort born in 1970, so here they would be born, and then as time progresses, you see they get older. So this is basically the life course of a person or of a generation. And what we have is that many things start here, like educational level or habits you pick up, health behaviors, having children, how your working career progresses, and the influences progress along that line. And then if a pension reform is implemented somewhere here, it basically has to deal with the situation here, but also counteract many influences that come from before. And I think that already like shows that this is not as easy as you would think, and maybe it would be better if pension reforms would actually start earlier. So if you would want to have a really effective pension reforms, you would have to start with children or middle-aged people. So there we come to social investment policies again. And then the other thing is also like if you implement a reform here, it will hit like these generations that you want to affect at an age where you cannot change that much in the life course anymore, but other generations you will affect at an age where you can change something, but they are the really young generations. So to really like see the full effects of a pension reform, you really need to look at generations who were younger and who then started to shape their lives according to the reforms. So there's quite some kind of like mismatch going on between like the time dimension, how pension reforms are supposed to work, and then how the lives of people would work. And to just wrap it up, some conclusions. Yeah, when we look at retirement and pensions, it's influenced by really many factors, but several of them really work in a long time span. And so if we introduce a pension reform that's supposed to show an effect on a short time span, this will probably not work because so many things that happened in the lives of people speak against it. And so what you could do about that, if you wanted to solve this problem, one is to just hear the options is just accept that it will not be 100% successful, and just be happy with saying, like, we tried to reform the pension schemes and we are going to get there 50%, and that would be one option. You could, of course, also say, if I want to reach age 65, then I'm going to put the reform to age 67, and then with 50%, I'm still going to be at the age I really need. That would probably be totally ineffective, and you would never get a reform like that approved by a parliament, but that would also be an option. Another thing would be to say, we're going to combine reforms in different areas. So that's also like what the representative from the Austrian ministry mentioned earlier on in the comment to Dirk, I think, that like there are reforms going on in different areas, and actually we need this combination of reforms. So that would then be, for example, like pensions together with like labor market integration of middle agers, probably childcare, something about migration and how that plays into the life course. Such a package could be way more effective than only going for pension reforms, or simply start to intervene at a way earlier age. So if you want pensioners who retire, or older workers who retire really late and who can work long, start with children and middle agers. So that would probably be the best approach, though on a really long time scale. Yeah. And then just a word of warning here in the end. About the economic crisis, I would also suggest to keep an eye on that, or also on the 1990s recession, because this will come back to us, like it will haunt us for a while. So just because the crisis goes down and the unemployment rates go down, the effect on pensions will come, and we still have to deal with that for a while. Okay, that's it. Thank you.